Hi, my name is Dorian, and this is You, Me, and the Industry. A podcast where I get to hang out with people from the games industry and talk with them about their job, the industry, a bunch of other stuff, and from time to time I get to have special conversations like this one. With me today is Rami Ismail, co-founder of the game development studio Vlambeer and the podcast called The Habibis. This episode centers around Rami's experience with the portrayal of Arabs and Muslims in video games, the highly controversial video game called 6 Days in Fallujah, its discourse in Western games media, and we discussed the global influence of the USA. I learned so much during this episode and I hope you do as well. Please, enjoy. Hello everyone and welcome to the show. Today it is my pleasure having Rami Ismail on the podcast. He previously was 50% of the game development studio Vlambeer, which released awesome games such as Nuclear Throne and Luftrausers. In 2018 he won the Game Developers Conference Ambassador Award. He's also a speaker, a consultant, and most recently became 31% of the podcast called The Habibis. Rami, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, how are you doing these days?
I mean, it's been a strange year for me. I've spent most of the last decade traveling around the world, meeting developers everywhere, making games in airports, airplanes,
Right.
Really getting to know game development on a global scale rather than the skill that we're used to. And obviously the COVID pandemic has sort of grounded me. So I've been in the Netherlands for over a year now.
Yeah.
Well, before you would be hard pressed to find me in the same continent for more than 3 weeks. So,
right, yeah,
it's been a very strange year, but it has shown me different perspectives to the work that I do and different opportunities that I have, and I think I'm ultimately grateful for that new perspective, but. It's not been a good year, I think, for anybody out there.
That's right, yeah. I mean, there's always some sort of benefits to some of this situation, like something like this, being able to arrange a podcast like this through the power of the internet. But I mean, it's still, of course, a very tough year, and it's just the restrictions on everyone and on just like on the mental side, it's just I can't even comprehend really sometimes.
And then we get to be grateful that our issues are mental our mental health rather than the actual death that is occurring in lots of places around the world for lack of access to a vaccine. So
totally, yeah.
It's been a year.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's when you then look back inwards and you look at your own life, you can only be grateful about my family is safe, my parents are safe, my loved ones are safe, and I could not be more thankful for how things are.
Yeah, I think if you just realize that we're all kind of blessed in this regard, being healthy and all, it makes this whole situation much more manageable, in my opinion.
Right. Yeah. It's like I said, it's such a difficult year to talk about that. When people ask how you're doing, I think most people have learned to just kind of dodge the question.
Totally, yeah.
Because it's easier to just not.
Yeah.
Because there's so many nuances and so many, I know things are worse elsewhere, and I know there are things, some people have it better, and we exist. We continue to exist.
Right, yeah. Yeah. And it is courtesy here with Yumi and the Industry of me asking people to bring a topic to the show. And usually these topics are very lighthearted, but I also like to take a moment and maybe focus on something more serious from time to time. And, with the whole origin of this podcast, it all started with like me once seeing a Twitter thread of somebody explaining like an origin story of how they made a magazine, for example. And, I always thought somebody should interview this person about this. And I think nobody really did, so I guess I had to step up myself and do this. And it was the same like this time with your tweet. And it all started with a tweet you made a couple of weeks ago about a certain issue related to the 6 Days in Fallujah video game, which was originally announced in 2009 and now got sort of re-announced this year. Because it got cancelled in 2009, I think, and then it got now re-announced to be re-released sort of, or now finally re-released. And you sort of talked about the issue of you as an Arab and your insight and your perspective on the US war propaganda being sold through, the very pages of game media. And you sort of complained that nobody was going to ask you about this sort of issue. And I thought, well, this is the reason I created this podcast, and I really wanted to have this episode right now.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, it was painful. Like the funny thing about that thread, it wasn't even my worry that nobody was talking to me. I just know that over the past 10 years, the game press at large just generally doesn't have Arab or Muslim or Middle Eastern contacts, right? So for many years, I've sort of fulfilled a silent switchboard function, right? When people needed people that know about the topic, they tend to reach out to me to see if I know anybody that can help. And it just stayed quiet. Right. And I know a lot of the Arabs, I know a lot of the Middle Eastern folks in the industry. And normally if there's something that they get interviewed about, they also come to me to just tell me about it.
Right.
And that also wasn't happening. So it was very clear that from the start, the initial response was that the major websites in the games industry interviewed the developer of 6 Days in Fallujah, Peter Tamt, and were distributing the trailer for that game with no counter voice, right? With no ability for anybody to speak about why this might be problematic.
Right.
And I feel like for any real life conflict, for any conflict that is ongoing and active and people are still being harmed by, we need a higher standard.
Right. Yeah, totally.
It wasn't, to me, it isn't. And there's the argument that it takes work, right? Like getting those contacts takes work. Getting those interviews done takes work because a lot of the people that are affected by this war also don't want to speak to American press.
Yeah.
But for me, from my perspective, if it takes time to do this, if it takes work to do this, then Peter Tamt's work also shouldn't be printed until that work is done.
Right.
Right. We should just wait until we have all the voices and then we can post about it. The press, in my opinion, fell short in that. And, I'm sure some people will disagree. Rebecca Valentine over at IGN did an incredible write-up where if that write-up had been published at the same time as Peter Tamt's work, that would have been great. Like I would have had not a single issue with the coverage of the subject. But the fact that we had to wait for 5.5 weeks to see any Arab voices is unacceptable if it's a game about us getting destroyed in real life.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and you mentioned already the article, and upon doing my research on this issue, I also stumbled upon this article, and it's really, really great. I'm also going to link it in the show notes. And why do you think this is such an issue? Do you really think that they just don't care, or do they just think, sort of like it is like it doesn't bring the clicks, just like a game trailer? It's easy to just upload a game trailer and say, well, here's the game trailer, remember this game? Or do you think there's like a sort of undertone, like a sort of ignorance about this type of...
I mean, an ignorance, perhaps. Some people in the press, and especially at these larger websites, there are some people that definitely are not ignorant about these issues. But I do think, in general, the Middle Eastern, North African region is somewhat forgotten as a place that contains humans, right? And it's it's a process of desensitizing people that has occurred over decades, right? The wars in the Middle East, as proxy wars against the Soviet Union even, have always been justified as we're going to fight bad people in the big desert to the east. And we're bringing freedom, right?
Right.
And in that way, Hollywood and U.S. media, with the overweight it has in the world, has very effectively explained that perspective, the perspective of we're doing good, we're bringing good, and we will make the world a better place.
Right.
While at the same time dehumanizing the people that live there by showing them only as terrorists, only as evil, only as people that will betray you, not actually showing their culture, not actually showing their language, sort of stereotyping them into this, kind of inhumane stereotype, to the point where scenes in our lands are usually filmed in a weird yellow tone, where even the sky is now green and everything looks a little sickly and broken.
Right.
The shadows are an unnatural color, the light is an unnatural color, just to remind people that these lands aren't like ours, and these people do not, they're not. It's like talking about whether, a fish feels pain when you catch it.
Right.
That's sort of the attitude that the U.S. at large has about or the U.S. government and the media and a lot of the coverage of the Middle East has that attitude towards it, where when instead of asking Iraqi people about the Iraq war, they will trot out a U.S. analyst that will talk to us about how the Iraqis feel. We just don't get a voice.
Right. And I think we also need to consider that America has a very strong soft power, which sort of means that they're highly influential when it comes to entertainment and other forms of media. And so they're sort of dictating the narrative when it comes to race, religion, and how people are portrayed, I think.
Not just that, it's also language, right?
Totally, yes. Right,
English, America controls the English. I mean, the Brits would like to control it, but the honest truth is that English as it exists now is American English.
Right, yeah.
Right, overwhelmingly on the internet. So even the words that we use to speak about these things are in their favor. We don't speak of civilian deaths, we speak of insurgent deaths. We don't speak of murder, we speak of casualties. We don't speak of innocent people dying, we speak of collateral. So we don't speak of invading a country for their oil, we speak of protecting the interest of the United States domestically and abroad, right?
Yeah.
So even in the language, the very words that we use to have this discussion, a lot of how we speak and what we speak about is colored through the lens of US propaganda.
Yeah, right. And also I think when you think about the power such also, for example, like they view themselves as not only like as America, but sort of like the hero always, or like the ones doing justice over the world, or like doing the world a favor by taking the responsibility, being brave, and sort of risking their lives in order to protect us from you. It's sort of the narrative. Like, I'm not meaning it literal, but I mean it's sort of the narrative that they're suggesting here.
And it's impressive because you go to the US, and I remember the first time I was there, I arrived at an airport, and the very first thing I heard on the speakers was something about thanking the troops and like a special veterans thing at the airport that they could go to, and I was just like, wow. No wonder that everybody is so enthralled with the military, right? And it's obviously unfair because America is the USA is an incredibly large country with a huge amount of people and different perspectives, and a lot of people are against the army. But for a lot of people, even US folks that have a pretty good idea of topics of diversity, topics of inclusivity, topics of treating everybody as human, people that are anti-military, people that are opposed to their government, still the amount of cultural conditioning that they're in that makes them look at the region in a specific way is incredibly overwhelming. And the only people we really get to hear speak about this are US Arabs, right?
Right.
Or sometimes UK Arabs. It's incredibly rare to hear any other perspective. And that's if those people even get asked, because normally they get skipped as well in favor of an analyst.
Yeah, totally. And do you sort of see sometimes that it's very, like, for example, the topic of diversity, it is very only looked at through the lenses of the USA or through America, and not really considering, for example, like, I mean, there's always the importance of Black people when it comes to diversity.
Right.
And but do you think there's like sort of like they're also sort of dictating how we view cultural diversity overall in the globe due to their soft power also through language, as you mentioned? I
mean, of course, there's going to be an overweight towards U.S. issues because, as we said, they sort of set the tone in terms of what we talk about and how we talk about it. That said, I have made the mistake in the past of seeing that as antagonistic, right?
Yeah, right.
Seeing that as a danger to getting representation for my own people, and that is a mistake that I've made that I regret deeply, because in essence there is no difference. There should not be antagonism between two people fighting the same thing, right?
Yeah, right.
Even though, yes, part of me wishes that we, as Arabs, we could speak as loudly in our own languages, unfiltered, right? That we could have the discussion in our words in a way that everybody around the world would understand. That's not how it is. That doesn't mean that the that the discussion is wrong for focusing on black people now, or on women, or on
sure.
gay people, or any other minority. We should stand in solidarity with them because they are fighting the same thing as us, and if they can get more freedom, chances are we can get more freedom, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally.
It's difficult. It's difficult, especially as an outsider to the US, to recognize just how much people there are in the US, right? I come from two relatively homogenous countries, Egypt and the Netherlands, where Egypt is overwhelmingly Arab and overwhelmingly Muslim, and the Netherlands is overwhelmingly white and overwhelmingly Christian atheist, right?
Right.
So to even imagine the amount of diversity that exists in the US in sometimes very small spaces is really hard.
Mm-hmm.
And to understand that the discussion about diversity is very different in a country where so many people live that close together is very different from how it is in the Netherlands, where it's kind of ignored, or in Egypt, where it's not spoken about at all, almost.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard. It's hard to understand that there is a tremendous hurt even within that country. While, growing up, you kind of just learn the US invades our countries, steals our land, and it doesn't really matter what kind of US person is doing it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's the US, right?
Right, yeah.
So that definitely took some unlearning on my behalf, and it's an ongoing process. It's hard. It's hard, especially when it comes to aggression, US aggression against, countries that look like my own.
Mm-hmm.
It's really hard for me to turn off that idea of like, okay, US people should just not speak right now.
Yeah.
I don't want anybody from the US to be talking about this unless they are an Arab.
Mm-hmm.
And if those people don't speak, then that is the US forcing that conversation to be held by other voices, right?
Right, yeah.
Excluding us from the conversation of our own hurt.
Mm-hmm.
So it's hard. Like, these things are hard. They're not easy. And I've come to learn over my past 10 years of travel, really, that diversity sounds really easy when you're just when you hold up a globe, right, and you look at it and you speak of diversity. It's relatively easy because when you just center America as a continent, right, North and South America, if you center that and Central America, if you center America on the globe and you say diversity, it's, even though there's strong differences between the different lands that are on there, there's still sort of like a framework that you can build, right? Like, a lot of the countries are results of European colonialism.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of these countries have certain views of the world. They're overwhelmingly Christian. Like, there's sort of like a sense. But if you spin the globe, and you say diversity, it's instantly impossible.
Yeah, right.
Because the views, the perspectives that exist become contradictory. They become opposite.
Mm-hmm.
They become hostile in some cases. And how do you reconcile that? How do you create a place that is inclusive and welcoming to everybody? And if you say, well, we can't do that, how do you make it fair that one of these groups has power over the entire games industry, right?
Yeah, totally. Mm-hmm.
So it's this complex, multi-layered battle that, as I fight it and as I try to figure out how to make this games industry fair,
Mm-hmm.
I just keep realizing more and more how out of my depth I am and how impossible the task is. But it's also sort of taught me to focus back in, right? I can't make things better for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And what I can do is I can make the industry, the resources, more accessible to everybody, right? I can make that more inclusive.
Yeah.
But in terms of representing cultures, in terms of sharing stories, there's really only my own story I can share, right? Which is the story of an Arab, the story of a Muslim, a story of a westernized Muslim, a westernized Arab, and the stories that I understand and that I can speak to with experience. And that kind of loops us back to 6 days. It is remarkable to me that a game that was killed in 2009 for being upsetting to veterans
Mm-hmm.
is now being released because it's no longer upsetting to veterans. Right?
Yeah, right.
And in that entire discussion, Iraqis were never mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
Right? There was objection about the Iraqis both times, but it's not a consideration in the development. And it's just sad to me that if you say you're going to make a game that shows the truth of Fallujah, right?
Mm-hmm.
The truth of Fallujah is not that it is the biggest urban warfare thing the U.S. who cares, right?
Yeah.
The reality is that this was a city full of innocent people that was besieged by foreign invaders that came there under a lie.
Yeah.
That destabilized the country to the point that extremist forces could take over large parts of the land, and then decided to besiege the city, didn't leave any man of military age out, and then shelled the city, threw white phosphorus on people, and went door to door killing people if they looked threatening. That's the story of Fallujah, right?
Yeah.
And if you say you're going to make a documentary about this, really, I don't like the obvious thing is I want to hear two perspectives, right? I want to hear the American perspective, the US perspective, and I want to hear the civilian perspective. But if you really want to get Fallujah, you need to have three perspectives. You need to have the US forces, which are invaders. You need to have the civilians, who are caught in the middle. And you need to have the extremists that are there because of the unstable situation in the land, right?
Yeah, right.
And if you can't do that, then you're not genuinely making the truth of Fallujah. You're not showing the real story, and marketing it that way is just incredibly cynical.
Yeah, totally.
So for me, that is kind of the thing that I don't get is if they had just marketed this the way it is, which is another game that shows the US military going, what was the joke again? US foreign policy is not only will we come to your country and destroy it, but we will come back 20 years later to make a movie about how sad it made our soldiers.
Potentially winning some Oscars.
Right. Yeah, presumably winning some Oscars. Those are like the stories of valor and heroism that the world really needs, apparently. Yeah, and another thing, the US controls all the prizes. But yeah.
Right, yeah.
The honest truth is, like, we've played that game. I've already played that game. You've already played. Everybody has played that game. Call of Duty is that game. Battlefield is that game. Medal of Honor is that game.
Right, yeah.
America's Army is that game. Like all of pretty much everything that has taken place in the Middle East in terms of game is about how a Western person goes and saves a thing from bad brown people. Like,
yeah.
I mean, if they had just marketed it as that, I'd have looked at it and been like, well, here we go again.
Yeah, it's just another day in the week, I guess.
Right. Yeah, it's a week between 0 and 53.
Yeah.
But the fact that this was promoted as something more actually was really exciting to me. Right? Can you imagine a game that actually like treats these topics with the perspectives and the insight that it deserves, where you get to see why these extremist forces moved in and why they are as they are, that we get to see the U.S. Military being lied to by their own leadership.
Yeah.
Expecting to go and be heroes and instead murdering civilians to steal oil, right? Like, what does that do to their psyche when they get home? Do they understand that they have been lied to?
Right, yeah.
Do they understand that they were dehumanizing real people? What does that do to a human? Like, that can't be good for the human mind. And if it is not bad for the human mind, then something is seriously wrong with that human.
Yeah, right.
But mostly, how does it feel to have your city invaded by two hostile forces and then end up in a city that is so radioactive from the depleted uranium ammo that sticks in the ground that almost 15 years after, or what is it? Yeah, more than 15 years after the battle, the ground is still irradiated and people are still, being born with much higher rates of mutations than before. How does it feel to be in a city knowing that you can't escape? Because if you try to leave, you'll get turned around. And you have to choose between letting your family through the US checkpoint and going back into the city alone, or, convincing them to leave you, or having to go back with your entire family because they can't survive without you. Like, how does that feel?
Right, yeah.
Instead, what we get is a game about how two US soldiers are nervous about opening a door, and we don't see the other side of the door.
Yeah, right.
We don't hear the other side of that story. We don't hear what it must be like to sit in your own house with bombs going off all around you, and then hearing two footsteps in the hallway and not sure if it's extremists that will kill you with no second thought.
Right.
Or US soldiers that will kill you with no second thought. What about the people that were defending Fallujah, not because they were extremists, because they were defending their home? We've heard the US story of the Russians are invading, we have to defend our houses. We've played that game. But now if you flip it around, we can't play that game. Right?
Yeah, right.
We can't be an Iraqi shooting a US soldier.
Yeah.
That would be unacceptable. You can't make a game like that. You can't sell a game like that. So when you speak of 6 Days of Fallujah, you're not just speaking of 6 days in Fallujah. You're speaking about the complete lack of understanding that there were humans in this war. And sure, Tamta says that he's interviewed a lot of Iraqis, but at the same time, he says that he hasn't heard anything about white phosphorus or war crimes, which to me means that he didn't speak to a lot of Iraqis, or he spoke to very specifically selected ones.
Yeah.
Because I've spoken to 24 of them, and I've heard those stories more than I've heard other stories, right? Like, war crimes was definitely a thing that came up in pretty much every conversation I've had.
Yeah, I mean, even I, who just did research for, I mean, I don't want to belittle this thing I'm doing right now, but I mean, just doing a podcast, not trying to sell a commercially game, even I came across white phosphorus, and it's not like I had to dig deep, or, you know, it's like, it's not like this like hidden secret of like, you know, opening like a hidden trapdoor or something. It's just blatantly on the internet, on YouTube, on anything, you know.
This was discussed in the UK Parliament.
Yeah.
Right, they discussed whether they could still be part of a war where white phosphorus was used against, against, between parentheses, insurgents, because it's illegal to use white phosphorus as a weapon.
Yes,
you can use it to illuminate or to suppress a position. You can't use it to attack people. Then again, you know, the U.S. is one of the main countries that isn't part of the International Court of Justice.
Yes.
And they actually have a law that if any U.S. person would be tried in the International Court of Justice in The Hague, they have a law that allows them to invade The Hague.
Yeah.
So we're not really looking for fair treatment from the U.S. because we know we won't get it. But to see that represented in games, and to see this horrible war that is, you know, the ground hasn't lost the irradiation yet. To see U.S. people make a U.S. game with only a U.S. perspective, rewriting the history to fit the U.S. view, to make U.S. dollars for a U.S. company, and then the U.S. press only asks the U.S. person. Like, that it becomes most people I spoke to laughed about it. We don't expect better, right? We don't expect there to be a fair treatment. We don't expect us to be asked. We don't expect us to be represented well in games. We're angry, but we're also tired. We're just tired.
Sure, yeah.
We're exhausted.
But I mean, isn't this sort of sad? Like, I mean, shouldn't you be? I think, like, I mean, I totally get you that you don't have like the energy anymore after all these years. But I think, well, I mean, like, in all honesty, I think you should be expecting better, right? I mean, it's just that you accepted sort of this, like, I mean, non-caring about this issue.
It should be better, but I'm not expecting it.
Yeah, right.
I'm like, the thing that scared me about the Iraq War of 2003 was that so many people saw it was wrong, right? So many people saw this was bad, and every Arab I spoke to back in the days, every Egyptian I spoke to was like, Rami, just be quiet, right? 2001 had just happened, 9/11 had just happened, and the last thing we needed was an Arab kid yelling about how unfair it was that Arabs were getting killed. Because, you know, 1 million Arabs does still not equate to, you know, the attacks of 9/11. Like, that doesn't count the same. And that's how it is. And they were scared of speaking. And I haven't grown. And I realized that's what I thought. I realized that I thought they were scared. They weren't scared. They were just tired. They knew it won't change anything.
Right.
And it doesn't. They were right. It doesn't change. So here we are again. Arab country, or Middle Eastern country, or Muslim country, bombed to the brink. And now extremist forces are moving through that space, installing authoritarian regimes. And then soon, the US, in the next 10, 20 years, the US is going to invade those countries because they are backwards and a threat to the stability of the region. Right? And then we go again. You know, if I have children, they will look at me and they will wonder why I'm not fighting, why I'm not upset, why I'm not angry. And they will wonder why I'm just sitting there being numb and being like, kids, it's, you know, it isn't how it should be, but it is how it is, right?
Right.
And sure, I will protest, and I will speak up, and I will try and be loud, but I won't be able to fix it. And I will have to explain, if I have children, I will have to explain to them that with their people, this is how the world is. And, you know, in 20 years, the US will make a movie about how it made their soldiers sad.
Yeah, right. And I guess it's also sort of like further insulting that the comments are made about like this being a game without trying to making a political commentary on this issue. Well, I guess it must feel like kind of infuriating, I guess.
The US is the only country in the world that can look at a war and say it's not political.
Right, yeah.
I genuinely think that they must be the only country in the world, because to them it isn't. It's heroics, right?
Yeah.
It's the US culture overwhelmingly has created this narrative of winning wars, and it's not a surprise that over decades of games industry, 60 years of games industry now?
Mm-hmm.
The first studio that made a game about war that wasn't about winning it was a German studio, and then the second one that it was a Polish studio.
Right.
There's no surprise in that. Of course, the U.S. couldn't do that. Of course, the U.S. was ill-equipped to do that. The U.S. culture sees war as a thing to win.
Right.
Well, the Germans see it as a destructive force that can tear apart a country, something that they are ashamed of, right? Something that they want to fight, those sentiments.
Mm-hmm.
And the Polish see it as something that happens to their country and destroys their cities, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it just makes me wonder, with all of these countries in the world, right? How come we only see the US, which wants to win wars, and the UK, which wants to conquer lands, right? Like those are the two perspectives we've seen. I would like to see some other ones. Why don't I see the Iranian perspective on war, right? Or the Iraqi one, or Africa? Any country in Central Africa, South America. Where are those? And it's because they don't get to be made.
Yeah, right. Mm-hmm. And it sort of feels like now more than ever, it's sort of like we're sitting on this kind of like, or not we, I mean in America, for example, they're sitting on this like sort of powder keg with like things like Black Lives Matter happening, like with the killing of George Floyd, and also recently the hashtag trending Stop Asian Hate after the killings of Asian people. And do you think like we're sort of slowly evolving into like this more of like racial issues, and also that is something like this going to ever happen with like about like Arabs and Muslims that are sort of like this I mean the topic trending.
The thing you have to remember is that both of those topics are in the US.
Right, yeah.
Right. And I hope, and it is my hope, that in the US these minorities that are fighting for their lives in what is effectively a militarized police state, right?
Right, yeah.
That they will get their freedom, and that they will have the support from anybody on the planet to reclaim equality.
Right.
But I do think that the US is ill-equipped to speak of these global issues, and that until they figure out the problems within their country, it's really hard for them to properly focus on these issues outside of their country.
Right.
And that makes sense. I mean, that would be the same if it was in the Netherlands. It would be the same if it was in Egypt. The U.S. just has the minorities in the U.S. have the misfortune of being a minority in the most powerful country on earth, which means that if they fight for their rights, if they speak loudly for their rights, their voice is going to be louder than the voice of, a Middle Eastern kid sitting in rubble because their parents have been killed in a strike. That is unfair. Of course it is unfair. And it's honestly unfair that anybody would have to, speak for their rights. But as it is, that is the way the world is. And it's not a competition. It isn't let's compare these things. It's
totally
very much people are fighting for their right to be heard, and we should find ways of supporting each other. It's just, as things are now, the big diversity discussions of our day are going to be about the US and how things are in the US. And as long as the conversation we have, as long as the language we have these conversations in is English, it'll always lean towards that.
Yeah, right. And moving on, in 2016 at GDC, you had a panel called Representation of the Middle East with Imad Khan, Farah Khalaf, Romana Ramzan, and yourself. Speaking of, like I said, representation of the Middle East. And sort of what has changed in 5 years? Is there any progress to be made?
Not really. If anything, there is an increased awareness that if you do something wrong, you will get, trouble. If anything, the fact that there are now some loud Arab voices that can speak, some loud Muslim voices that can speak, it means that you won't get away with it quietly. You'll get away with it, right? You'll get away with misrepresenting us. You'll get away with misrepresenting our languages, our cultures, our lands. Because in the end, your game will still sell, right? And the conversation that'll happen around the game will be 5.5 weeks late, right? But there is a sense, I think, in the industry of trying to get these things right. Because the industry in itself is relatively progressive, right? It tries to get things right. There's just commercial forces and cynicism and ignorance that stop that from happening. So the louder we can speak and the more painful we can make getting it wrong, the more likely it is for things to get better. But the honest truth is, that shouldn't be up to the Arabs. It shouldn't be up to the Muslims. It shouldn't be up to the Middle Eastern people. Like,
right.
If you're making money off of our culture, off of destruction of our people, off of the murder of our children, then you should do the research. We shouldn't be asked to yell on Twitter for free about these things.
Yeah.
People should be hiring locals to get this right and making sure that the language is correct. I gave a talk at XOXO where in 18 minutes I taught an audience of non-Arab speakers enough Arabic that they could recognize bad Arabic in a video game. It took me 18 minutes, right?
Right, okay.
If I can do that in 18 minutes, how come that Battlefield 3, with a budget of over $100 million, still gets the word hotel backwards?
Right.
Right? That is unacceptable. And the fact that it is still happening is unacceptable. Recently, IO Interactive with Hitman got the Arabic wrong in their Dubai mission.
Right, yeah.
And I love IO, and I'm sure that the way they've represented most of Dubai in that clearly shows that they've done research, but still that something as sloppy as that could happen. It's sad. It's painful.
Yeah. I mean, you often refer to the isitarabic.com page, which is just like opening up a page and it tells you, well, I mean, there's like, does it look like this or does it look like this? And if it looks like this, it might be wrong.
Yeah, it's likely wrong, right? And that's all we're asking. We're at the point where that's all we're asking.
Yeah, right.
That's it. We're not asking for super complicated things. Just please don't represent us as terrorist murderers. Please don't only show our countries if they're on fire. Please don't go into our countries as the liberator.
Yeah.
And if you speak of us, please include us. Right? Those are the things we're asking for. That's still too much to ask.
Yeah, right.
And that is sad. That we are excited when we get that we were excited in our community, right? The group of people that was interviewed for Rebecca's incredible article over at IGN. A lot of them I know. And that we were excited about them being asked 5.5 weeks late about this is painful to me because I know it can be better, right?
Yeah,
that it should be better. So for me, the honest truth is, no, it hasn't gotten better. It's still up to us as a minority to improve things. And until that is no longer the case, we're not in a good spot.
Yeah, right. I've told about soft power before, and I mean, comic book movies and TV shows are now massively popular, being like the biggest grossing movies ever, the most watched TV shows. And recently mentioned on Twitter again that even with a show, even with a big show like Falcon and the Winter Soldier, they still get the Arabic sort of wrong. I mean, there were some regards that they did right with the signs, but I mean, even like the spoken language there, I think like the Falcon you mentioned was like trying to speak some Arabic, but it was still kind of wrong.
I genuinely have no idea what Sam was saying. It was so confusing.
Right.
But that is one of the least offensive examples in the MCU, because in Civil War there's just the words United Nations printed backwards.
All right.
On a United Nations logo, where you can literally go to un.org/AR and see what it should look like, and somehow this $100 million movie gets United Nations wrong in Arabic.
Yeah, right.
The opening sequence of Falcon and the Winter Soldier is in Tunis, where they're going to shoot some French terrorists over Middle Eastern line. Like, yeah, great. We haven't been through enough proxy wars. Like, that's what we want to hear.
Yeah, right.
Iron Man 3 did a fake out where it was not the actual Arab terrorists. It was actually this other guy. It's everywhere. It's what's the other? The Boys, where it turns out the bad guy is actually Homelander, right? Like, that's kind of like the story. The superhero character is the villain. So to show how bad he is, he goes into a hijacked airplane, which is hijacked by a bunch of Arabs, kills them, and then lets the airplane crash, and that makes him the villain. But the fact that they just went with Arabs for the terrorists,
casually,
just like oh yeah, no, they're dead. They're not actually, they're bad guys, but they're not like the big bad guy. They're just like a way to show you how bad our bad guy is. Like,
yeah, he's like even worse than the terrorist.
He's worse than the terrorist. That's literally the play they made in that series. Right. It's like stuff like that. You get so numb. You look at it and you're just like, oh yeah, let's see. Oh, they're introducing an Arab character. Let's see how quick they're dead or traitor.
Yeah, right. I mean, it also must feel especially painful since they are trying to it appears that they are trying to make some progressive steps towards having like a Muslim character with Miss Marvel, and she's also getting her own show. But I think, I think it is it is your right that you're sort of like doubtful about the handling of this character, and also like how she's represented as well.
Right.
Again.
Yeah, I don't know. Like I hope it's good. I really hope it's good, because then we have one, right?
Yeah. Right.
One. That's it.
One to represent all.
We have one that has to represent everything, and that's unfair to the character. So I'm gonna look at it with as open a mind as possible.
Yeah. Right.
Because she's not Egyptian.
Yes.
Right. But I sure hope that she won't be westernized to the point where I don't recognize, because ultimately I think she's still a U.S. character, right?
Yeah. Totally. Mm-hmm.
But I hope that she won't be westernized to the point where it's more of a backdrop than a real part of her life, right? Because that's how it is, and I hope it doesn't get flattened to look at how bad things were after 9/11. I hope it actually like goes into the culture the way some wonderful movies recently have about other minorities and other cultures. Like the latest thing we've gotten is the United States of Al, which is a CBS Big Bang Theory style thing about an Afghani translator that comes to the US with their U.S. military buddy and now gets to live in the garage and gets to be thankful about it.
Yeah, right. And he's also sort of like represented as like a sort of alien person, like not understanding how the world functions.
What is the proper way of doing things, right? And then he's gonna melt their hearts by living in the garage.
Yeah.
And being sort of old-fashioned.
Yeah, and like this sort of like stranger knows a certain way of like life that the Westerners can't see, but they can learn from each other.
Right.
Of course. Yeah.
Thankfully, sadly, in reality, most of the Afghan translators are still stuck in Afghanistan and have probably been murdered because they were abandoned by the U.S. military, who refused to give them a visa to come to the U.S.
Yeah, right. I remember you posting an article. I'm also going to link that one in the show notes.
That's what actually happened. Like much. Remember there was an airplane that got shot down above Iran by the Iranian air defense systems, and the U.S. was outraged that could happen, right? Did you know that the U.S. shot down an airplane, a passenger airplane just like that a few decades ago, and refused to apologize for it?
Okay. Oh, I didn't know that.
No, I mean, most people don't, because people don't talk about it.
Right, yeah.
But it shot down an actual airliner, passenger airliner, and when asked to apologize, it was an Iranian flight as well, by the way, also from Tehran.
Right.
Flight 665 or 655 or something.
Yeah.
Was shot from the air by a cruiser. 290 people died, and obviously the International Court of Justice recognized that what happened, but the U.S. passenger, I think, I wish I could find the quote, but said something along the lines of, "I will never apologize for the United States of America."
Nice.
And then when Iran does it, it's like unacceptable.
Right, yeah.
So it's that kind of thing where, where you just look at it and you're like, well, we don't really have to expect anything. We don't really have to expect anything fair.
Right, yeah.
Here, I will never apologize for the United States. I don't care what the facts are. I'm not an apologize for America kind of guy.
I mean, like, to be honest, it sounds almost like a parody of itself. Like, I mean, it's like sort of like just insert like like, you know, very brave words, or like look very patriotic words, and it's just like making like a patriotic sentence into like a generator. It sounds like
Right.
really, I don't know. It sounds like making, I don't know, something like a comedy series would make.
Right. And then it gets more ridiculous when you realize that the state of Iran as a country right now is mostly due to a U.S. coup, and that the
Right,
economic
yeah.
circumstances are because of a U.S. sanction that was installed against the government that the U.S. coup installed in that country. It's
Right,
like
yeah.
the more you look at what the world is and how it works and how things are portrayed, how we think we understand things, especially in the West, and you compare it to what is actually happening, because I had the benefit of growing up with the Dutch news on the one side and Arab news on the other side.
Yeah.
And you look at the two stories and you realize how different they are. Right. And obviously it's not like the Arab news is the truth. Like, it's their propaganda. Right.
Yeah.
But in the middle between the two sits a very uncomfortable world that is probably close to what the world actually is.
Yeah, right. Unfiltered, sort of like seeing both sides sort of makes
Right.
you like makes you read between the lines.
Right. And it's just kind of scary how rare that perspective is, right? Whenever something happens in the Middle East, my brain immediately jumps to the time the West did the same thing, because I've heard that on the news, right? Or why the West is responsible for the situation as it is. But that is something that I always have to explain on Twitter.
Right.
I have to go on Twitter and be like, well, y'all, like, yeah, that's messed up, but also, did you know that? I shouldn't be the one writing these threads. Like, this should be part of education, but it isn't.
Yeah. Right. And yeah, well, speaking of Twitter, you were also recently talking about a tweet by Annie Munition talking about her experience being biracial and reclaiming her ethnicity proudly. And you're sort of reminiscing about, that you were also feeling sort of the same feelings she was describing in her video.
Right.
And sort of in the end made you sort of reclaim your own identity proudly. So maybe you can sort of elaborate on this a little bit.
Right. I mean, if you grow up, you know, biracial or a kid of two cultures, you kind of really quickly learn to hide as much of that as possible, because racism is very real, pretty much everywhere. And you know, being the kid that celebrates Ramadan while the other kids celebrate Christmas, you just kind of get sad.
Right.
You know, you're kind of the outsider. And if there's anything you don't want to be as a 6-year-old, it's an outsider.
Yeah, totally.
So from pretty early on in your life, you learn to downplay what is different about you. And I think when I was around 14, 15 years old, I started to sort of realize that it was not right that I was downplaying that, but I didn't have the guts at that point to sort of loudly reclaim that. So I mostly claimed it in jokes, right? When I would get in trouble at school, I would say something like, "Oh yeah, it's probably because I'm Muslim, isn't it?"
Right.
And like give the teachers grief over stuff like that. But I wasn't like actually claiming it.
Right.
If anything, I was sort of like joking at it, so that if somebody called me out on it or said something about it, I'd be like, "Oh yeah, it's just a joke," because you're scared. Of course, you're scared. Like, and I you can't hide it. I still look different, right?
Right.
The truth is, you start to believe that you can just sort of like wish it away, and then when you realize what you've been doing, it hurts. It sucks. It's the worst. You realize that you've been hiding half of you away because that's easier, and especially when you start to grow a platform, and you know, people look up to you or people see you, and you realize that there's so many kids that are probably looking for a role model that I never had, right? And I could be that, and I'm choosing not to. Gosh, is that heartbreaking? And then you have to claim that spot, right? But with it comes all the minority responsibilities. Now you are a visible minority, and just like Kamala will have to represent a lot as you know, in the MCU. Any individual cannot be the visible minority for Muslims.
Right, yeah.
Right?
Right.
Yet for a time I was. And it's harsh. It's weird. It's uncomfortable.
Right.
But you try, because, you know, how many get the chance? So many of us that wish they could speak can't speak, because our events are in the United States, right? The press is in the United States. And if you want to get a job in the games industry, you better have access to the United States.
Yeah,
Because you're not getting in any leadership position if you can't do interviews at E3 because the US will block you, right?
Right, yeah.
You won't be able to sell your games in the US if your country is sanctioned. You won't be able to participate in an industry if you get refused access to the nation. And people go like, well, who gets refused access to the nation? Well, Palestinian kid, civilian kid, was at a university in the US, got refused access to the United States over a picture a friend of his had sent to his phone via WhatsApp. And the customs found that picture and went, yep, you're banned. A single trip to Iran will invalidate any visa waivers you have for the US for the rest of your life. Right?
Yeah.
Like getting refused to the US is the standard.
Right.
It's just hard to imagine if you live in the US or you are European and you have access to it. But if you've ever, if you've ever been not that, or you've ever worked with people that are not that, you suddenly realize just how ridiculous things are. So even a lot of the people, even a lot of the Arabs, a lot of the Muslims, a lot of the Middle Eastern folks that could speak up, shouldn't.
Right, yeah.
Because it will harm their career and we will lose a role model.
Yeah.
So we're in this weird balancing act right now where we're trying. We're really trying. We'll figure it out. For now, the best we have is, at least, there's a lot of little communities, but I've tried to help start something that will be more of a hub for that with a podcast that I'm doing now.
Yeah, right.
Called the Habibis. And it's 3 Arab game developers. We try to invite people from the games industry that are Arab, that are Muslim, that are Middle Eastern, hear their stories. But the hope is sort of that it can be a home, a place of getting together and like finding recognition, talking of our culture without having to explain it.
Right.
And hopefully a place of opportunity for the future. So, we keep trying different ideas and see what sticks.
Yeah, I think that sounds awesome. And maybe following up that the question about the tweet, I'm just very sorry to tell you that there isn't a German word for tearfully smiling and recognizing someone's hurt from your past to reveal that they have said hurt by rising above it. I'm sorry, since I'm a German, I'm going to have to tell you that there isn't a German word for that.
No, it's a shame. I actually speak German. It's more of an in-joke about German.
Right, yeah, totally.
I
get it.
I love the language so much because
Yeah.
the way you can compound words into other words is just phenomenal. Dutch has it a little bit, but we usually give up at like 2-3 words.
Right.
The Germans will go for like 5, 6, 7 words. And you're just like,
right, yeah.
Y'all can stop now.
Yeah, but we're always like, it has to be very precise.
Right.
Like for this one instance, it has to be as precise as possible.
Right. I love it. It's borderline inspiring.
Yeah, right. And you already mentioned that being an Arab, you can't really speak out about certain issues. And we already touched upon your love for, flying and going to the airport and visiting other countries. And, it makes me sort of not question, but I think it's very interesting because your experience is vastly different than my experience at the airport because you look a certain way. So maybe you can also, maybe go into this a little bit.
Yeah. So I've flown around the world for 10 years straight, right?
Right.
Not spent longer than 3 weeks in any continent for a decade.
Right.
I'm a frequent flyer. I'm at the point where I've almost flown so much that I've been platinum for 10 years straight.
Yeah.
Which will give me platinum for life, which is the highest rank I can get on my airline. And I'm actually gold on 2 other airlines. I've flown too much, right?
Right, yeah.
I have, for access to the US, I have done something called Nexus, which is basically to do a very strict interview and a very strict deep dive into your history, check everything to make sure that you're safe. And if so, you get easier access to the US, which I got because it computerizes it. Despite all that, and despite being a European citizen, I would get random checked on approximately 1 in every 3 flights.
Yeah.
Where the global average is about 1 in 20 to 1 in 50.
Right.
Right. So, did I get random checked became a joke. Because, yes, I did. And it was interesting in that, for me, I thought that was just the usual experience. You go fly, you get patted down, they open your suitcase, they ask you what underwear is, and then you go like, well, that's underwear. And they go like, right. And they put your underwear back in. They take the wheels off of your suitcase, you get extra checks, they pat you down.
Very normal, right?
Yeah, you get in a little room, and you sit there for like 45 minutes until somebody talks to you. You get grilled about your parents. Like, I thought that was what flying was.
Yeah, sure.
Right.
I guess, yeah.
And I would miss flights over this, right? I would miss a flight, and I would have to go the next day, or
Right.
sit at a gate and be rejected boarding.
Right, yeah.
Until I realized that wasn't normal.
No, yeah.
I had no idea. That's just how it went for me. So around 2014, when I realized just how weird my flight experience was, I started to track that, and I started a website called didRamiGetRandomChecked.com.
Right.
Where I would just track how often I got random checked. And in that year, where I flew all around the world, it was 1 in every 5 flights.
Wow.
Right. Where I would get random checked. And I defined a random check as anything that involved me having to speak to additional people. Right. Them patting down my suitcase or something, I didn't count that.
Okay.
But me having to answer additional questions or step out of line or go to a different line, go to a little scary room, that kind of stuff, I counted as a random check. And it was 1 in every 5 flights.
Yeah, crazy.
Yeah, no, my name is 5 Arab names. Well, technically 7, but there's only 5 on my passport because European systems didn't support the Arab naming system.
Right.
But yeah, it always starts very nice. They go "How are you doing, sir?" I'm like, "I'm good. How are you?" They're like, "Good. Thanks for asking. What brings you to the United States?" I'm like, "Oh, games conference." And they get to the page with my name, and they just go right. Could you just step over there for a second? I'm gonna have to take your passport for a moment. I'll be right back. You know how scary it is to lose your passport when you're traveling abroad? Well, I lost it every time I went through a U.S. immigration gate. And I didn't know for how long. Sometimes for 20 minutes, sometimes for an hour. Sometimes I would get back after 3 hours after getting interrogated. Right? That was just fine. Flying is also not equal. And then I'm the lucky one.
Yeah, right.
Because I get to fly. Most people, they have to get a visa before they can fly. But because I'm European, I get to dodge that one. But with that level of distrust, right? Getting a visa, it ain't happening. It's just not happening.
Yeah, right.
A lot of Arab, Middle Eastern, Muslim folks don't get to go to Europe or the US. It's just not.
Yeah.
It's not how it works.
Right. Yeah, I mean, even though you're there's a sort of, I think, joke you made on the panel. You said you're even one of the good ones, the westernized ones. You're the ones of who has been cultured by our great Western civilization. And yes, exactly. So I think it must be very I guess terrifying and even I don't know, almost impossible for people who haven't had who don't have this sort of quote-unquote privilege.
You speak to an Iranian developer, an incredibly good Iranian developer that had incredible opportunity to do amazing work if only they got access to the US to work with the studio that they've dreamed of working on, and sanctions. So no. Just end of story. They didn't even check his story. They didn't even check him. They didn't ask any questions. They just looked at it and they went, Iranian, no.
Yeah, right.
Well, the US is the same country that's responsible for the state Iran is in and for the sanctions. So it's wild that people's lives and dreams are just destroyed like that. But it's the most normal thing in the world to any Arab, any Middle Eastern person, any Muslim.
Yeah, and I think also, you mentioned about not really sort of recognizing, the Middle East as a legitimate place on the earth. I think on a different episode, we were talking about video game publishers not even sort of acknowledging the regions, sort of Sony, that there's not even a region for the Middle East, that they sort of all have to get American accounts and and download the games through the American PlayStation Store or Xbox Store or something. It's also, I guess, sort of in reinforcing this, this isn't a legitimate region, this isn't real.
Right. Yeah, but this is true for most of the world. The global South barely has any representation from Nintendo, from Sony, from Microsoft, from anything, honestly.
Yeah, right. Mm-hmm.
Middle East is just an extension of that. We're just we're considered basically global South, but up in the north, right?
Right, yeah.
But just not real, not a real place. It's not a real consideration. There's no real people, or backdrops for stories about heroism and Western heroism, preferably. So it's not fair. Things aren't fair. Things aren't even close to fair. The publishers don't look at those lands. You can't even, if you are in Iran, you couldn't even release your game on Steam or iOS or Android because the sanctions don't allow U.S. companies to work with Iranians. Language, you have to put your game in English, otherwise it won't sell. right? So you also need to be
Right, yeah.
English. To code, you have to speak in English. To render Arabic
yeah.
in a game, you would need to do a lot of extra work to get it right. So just to make a game, the amount of extra steps anybody in the Middle East would have to go through in North Africa is ridiculous. And still, the thing that gets me, right, and you will never be able to say that the Arabs, the Middle Eastern folks, the Muslims in the world, that they aren't people with perseverance, is they still do it. They're still making games, right? They're still everywhere, and they're still growing, reaching new heights, making new games, creating their own industries, making their own publishers, creating their own events. Like, they will get there, right? The people in the region, they're used to things being unfair. They know things are unfair. They will make it work, and it's the most inspiring thing you will ever see. It's just the perseverance of hope in a world that is unfair and that treats them as the enemy. It's really impressive.
Yeah, right. And, maybe to end on a sort of, hopefully, a positive note of the podcast. In a couple of weeks will be Ramadan. And in 2020, you had an iftar in Animal Crossing.
Right.
I hope I pronounced it right. Anything planned for 2021 like this?
So my hope is actually to, instead of doing it in Animal Crossing, which, I still like the game, but I haven't played it much lately. I feel really bad about having to face my villagers again.
Same.
I think we'll use the Habibis as a home, as a hub for Ramadan this year.
That's great.
For the first time, I think, in the games industry, there will be a Ramadan-focused event that actually honors Ramadan the way it should be. From the ground up, not added to another game by somebody who modded it in, not a little event that was added to a game that has nothing to do with it. But like an actual thing that was built for Arabs, for Muslims, for Middle Eastern folks, that celebrates not just the religious relevance of Ramadan, but also the cultural relevance of Ramadan.
Yeah.
For me, that's very exciting. It's a lot of work, though. It turns out that Ramadan is a good 30 days.
Yeah, right.
That's a lot of content. So we're working on it, and it's very exciting, to be honest. I'm excited for it.
Yeah, I'm looking forward. And thank you so much for doing this interview with me. I hope you had a somewhat great time here.
I had a good time. Yeah, these are tough. They're tough subjects,
right?
And they're the kind of subjects where every time you talk, every time you discuss them, there's going to be something that you said that you're going to look at and you'll be like, oh, I could have said that better, or I could have worded that better. But the only way to get better at those things is to do it, right? So I'm grateful for the opportunity. And I appreciate all the questions. It was a fun show. Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah, and before we're closing, do you want to shout out somebody or something besides the Habibis? I'm also going to link them in the show notes. And with all the great stuff you're doing over there, is there something you want to shout out? Maybe your Twitter or somebody else?
So I'm on Twitter, THA_Rami. You can find me there. That's where I do most of my stuff. Let's see, what would I want to shout out? Maybe I'll shout out something completely different, but my mom, who's also a gamer and who teaches me forever about games because she Twitch streams nowadays. She streams at Mom VS Games. I can recommend that. And then, as you said, the Habibis, the podcast, for the Arab side of my culture, is you can find that at thehabibis.com. I think that would be the main things I would shout out right now. Anything else that I think is worth shouting out, you can find via those three things. Yeah,
great. And, as for myself, you can find me on Twitter at Dorian Chow and on Instagram. And if you want to like and follow the show, you can, like us, give us a 5-star review or something on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, whatever you're doing. And, like I said at the show, where I put some of the show notes and also some behind-the-scenes information and sometimes pictures and stuff, are on Twitter at Yumi Industry, Facebook, and Instagram. And I hope really that if somebody listens to this and really wants to talk about a certain issue that they are sort of feeling that they aren't represented well, or nobody gives them a platform, I really hope that this in the future can be the platform for this, that they're just like, well, Twitter isn't really good for this. I really want to talk about it because I think Twitter is such a bad platform for nuanced takes with like lots of depth. And the moment you write something, it's already you're writing the second tweet, it's already misquoted and like misunderstood 1,000 times. And I think if anybody's interested in talking about such an issue like this or something else totally unrelated, maybe their origin story or something, I hope they can find me and come towards me and ask if you could be on the show. I would really appreciate the opportunity. And I guess that's it for the show. Thank you very much, and take care, everyone. Bye.